That legendary territory, the same one that in the times of Persian splendor had sculpted its name in stone and gold on the maps of the known world, now lay wrapped in a tense, military, and absolute silence. There was no longer a trace of the courts open to Western trade, nor of the rulers who sought to dress an ancient nation in the silks of modern progress. What remained was a fenced fortress, a structure held up only by the steel of its missiles and the fervor of a wounded pride that refused to bow to the weight of global restrictions. If one looks at the waters of the Persian Gulf, the reality is heartbreaking. In the gloom of the Arabian night, a cheaply made drone zooms through the air with a monotonous hum, challenging a billion-dollar American aircraft carrier waiting in the distance. It is an unequal clash, an artificial peace bought with threats of dispatch and naval patrols holding their breath in fear that a single miscalculation will unleash disaster. The truth of this conflict is not written in the elegant speeches of the White House, nor in the solemn proclamations from the altars of Tehran. The gap that separates these two powers is not a simple geopolitical dispute, it is a deep wound that has been bleeding for generations, a fracture that no one dares to cross for fear of the ghosts that live deep down. Every economic measure that drowns the streets, every projectile intercepted at sea, and every veiled warning are not events of the present. They are the direct continuation of a tragedy that began decades ago, when the invisible threads of betrayal and revolution changed the destiny of the Middle East forever. Two irreconcilable worlds today measure their forces on a worm-eaten board. How did the United States and Iran reach this point of no return? Join us to discover. The Roots of Fire. In 1953, the map of that ancient nation began to be drawn with the invisible traces of foreign betrayal. Iran was then a young democracy, a soil awakened by the promise of controlling its own destiny under the leadership of Mohammad Mosaddegh. That bold man, with his firm gaze and simple clothing, committed the unforgivable sin in the eyes of the Western powers, nationalizing oil, snatching wealth from the thirsty fields to deliver it into the hands of his own people. Until then, colossal oil profits flowed exclusively into the halls of London through the Anglo-Iranian Oil Company, while the common citizen in Abadan survived in absolute misery, without clean water or living wages. Mosaddegh challenged the established colonial order, but the response from Washington and London was not long in coming in the basements and secret offices. Through a covert operation signed by President Eisenhower and executed by CIA agent Kermit Roosevelt, the so-called Operation Ajax bought wills, financed artificial riots in the streets of Tehran and caused the legitimate government to be overthrown in tragic silence, breaking institutions and crushing sovereignty in the name of trade and geopolitical control of crude oil. In the vacuum of that stolen freedom, the West imposed the iron fist of Mohammad Reza Pahlavi, the Shah of Iran, an absolute monarchy that dressed in finery, diamonds and French silk in the lavish halls of the Golston Palace, while its secret police, the feared Savak, trained by Western agents, spread terror, medical torture and isolation in clandestine prisons. That royal opulence, which purported to show a modern and Europeanized country, was in reality an organized lie, an eroded structure, sustained only by the pride of a privileged elite, stolen oil money and the backing of American fighter jets. For 26 years, the country lived in deep division. In the capital, the royal banquets seemed endless, reaching their peak at the lavish celebration of the 2,500 years of the Persian nation in Persepolis, where the Shah spent millions importing banquets by plane directly from Paris, while the southern provinces lacked schools and clean water. Just a few kilometers from those palaces, everyday reality, the one that sweated and suffered in the workshops and thirsty fields, accumulated a deep resentment in the gloom. It was a wound that no one in Washington wanted to hear, but that millions of marginalized citizens were silently nursing, waiting for the day when they could defend their identity and their faith by force. The pressure cooker finally exploded with the roar of 1979. The Islamic Revolution was not a simple regime change, it was a spiritual and political earthquake that swept away the portraits of the Shah and brought Ayatollah Khomeini back from exile on an Air France plane acclaimed by crowds. Overnight, former strategic partners became permanent enemies. The elegance of the diplomatic delegations gave way to street slogans. The seizure of the American embassy in Tehran and the long, agonizing 444 days of the hostage crisis sealed a complete break. That was not just a diplomatic incident, but a dark abyss that transformed the politics of the region into a sworn hatred that would define the following decades. The Islamic Republic was born repudiating the Western order in the motto of neither East nor West, and Washington swore not to forget the humiliation of its citizens held before the world's television cameras. The punishment for that revolutionary audacity quickly spread to the waters and sands of the region. During the 80s, the board became even bloodier. Fearing the expansion of the Islamic tide through the oil wells of the Gulf, Washington and its allies financed, armed and provided satellite intelligence to the advance of Iraq, governed by Saddam Hussein, in a brutal war of attrition that lasted 8 eternal years. It was a fratricidal conflict that bled an entire generation of young Iranians, sent to the front lines with little more than plastic keys around their necks and the promise of paradise. The border plains of Fao and Basra were filled with infected trenches and lethal clouds of indirectly supplied mustard gas and sarin gas, a silent suffering from which the West preferred to avert its gaze in the UN offices. The Persian Gulf then became a theater of direct combat. In the final phases of that war, the dispute over tanker trade routes dragged the U.S. Navy into the center of the fire. In April 1988, after an Iranian mine hit the destroyer Samuel Roberts, Operation Praying Mantis demonstrated the relentless power of American forces by launching guided missiles and destroying much of Tehran's naval fleet in a matter of hours. The Sasson and Siri oil platforms burned on the horizon like gigantic torches, making it clear who dominated the waves. But the true point of no return, the tragedy that was forever etched in the collective soul of the nation, occurred that same July in the sky over those same waters. A radar-guided missile, launched from the American cruiser Vincennes, shot down Iran Air Commercial Flight 655, erasing 290 civilian lives in an instant, including 66 children. The wreckage of the Airbus and the bodies of entire families floated on the waters of the strait. For the United States, it was a tragic misidentification in the heat of a naval skirmish, a technical failure on an Aegis radar display. For Iran, it was definitive, absolute, and heartbreaking proof that its rival would stop at nothing, taking innocent lives in order to destroy them. When the 8 Years' War came to an end after the signing of Resolution 598, the geography of the region was already broken. Deaths, betrayals, and maritime offensives had solved nothing. On the contrary, they had left a building in ruins, a territory where mutual trust had completely disappeared. Each of these historical scars was closed with the fire of resentment, a fire that remained alive in the memory of the barracks and the mosques, waiting for the next move on this eternal board. That precarious balance, built on the blood and fire of the 80s, remained frozen in time, a silent but suffocating truce where both rivals looked askance at each other across the fortified borders of the Gulf. However, the new century would bring with it a geopolitical whirlwind that no one in Washington could foresee. In 2003, the soil of the Middle East once again shook the tracks of Western tanks. The United States, driven by the impact of 9/11 and the rhetoric of the axis of evil, decided to march on Baghdad to overthrow Saddam Hussein's regime. In the American capital, strategists with ties, satellite maps, and elegant speeches spoke of sowing democracy with precision Tomahawk missiles, of redesigning the entire regional geography in their image and likeness. They thought they were winning a definitive and overwhelming game, but in reality, they were opening Pandora's box. The fall of Saddam Hussein was a spectacle of steel, smoke, and toppled statues in Firdos Square that was broadcast live to all corners of the planet. The secular dictator who had held back the Islamic tide and the Iranian advance for an entire decade disappeared into a hole in the ground in Anwar. But in destroying the Iraqi state apparatus, the United States made its most tragic and consequential miscalculation. Without realizing it in his military euphoria, he eliminated Tehran's greatest historical enemy in one fell swoop, demolishing the only real retaining wall that separated the Islamic Republic from the rest of the Arab world. In the immense power vacuum left between the smoking ruins of Baghdad, a dark abyss of anarchy, insurgency, and disorder, Iran saw its golden opportunity to rewrite the rules of the game. Tehran's strategy for this new century was designed with a ruthless and silent cunning. While American soldiers patrolled the dangerous streets suffering the daily wear and tear of an armed urban resistance, the generals of the Quds force, in the strategic command of General Qasem Soleimani, operated in the shadows of clandestinity. At no time did they seek a direct or conventional clash against the world superpower. They knew perfectly well that the technological and air force of their rivals was overwhelming and destructive. Instead, they decided to weave an invisible web, a silent but fierce structure that would methodically feed off the chaos left by the West. This is how the phenomenon of war by proxy began to take shape, a board of shadows where the strings moved from distant offices in Tehran but carried out their blows thousands of kilometers away. That intricate web of influence soon became a heartbreaking reality for Washington's strategic interests. Iran did not send large divisions of its regular army across the borders, it sent military advisors, briefcases full of money, religious doctrine, and hidden shipments of weapons. Taking advantage of the discontent and fervor of Shia populations who had been historically marginalized by the old regime, he began founding, financing, and training local factions such as Kataib Hezbollah in the heart of Iraqi soil. Those armed groups grew and multiplied in the shelter of the foreign occupation itself, eating away from within the new state institutions that the United States intended to build with investments of billions of dollars. Suddenly, the reality of day-to-day life revealed that transcendently political decisions were no longer made in the green zone of Baghdad, but in the direction and silent advice of Iranian emissaries. This geopolitical expansion did not stop on the plains of Iraq. With almost religious patience and a long-term vision, the Iranian regime consolidated what the world today knows as the axis of resistance, a human, political, and military shield that crosses the entire geography of the Middle East. In Lebanon, they reinforced and professionalized Hezbollah, transforming a local resistance guerrilla into a quasi-state armed force, possessing an arsenal of more than 100,000 rockets capable of making any modern army on the planet hesitate. In Syria, when the violent civil war unleashed in 2011 threatened to topple Bashar al-Assad's dynasty, Iran immediately intervened with massive financial resources and thousands of fighters in an alliance of absolute survival, thereby ensuring a direct land corridor connecting Tehran to the shores of the Mediterranean Sea. Finally, the last link in this complex network was ignited on the strategic coasts of the south, in the thirsty, mountainous lands of Yemen. There, the Houthi rebels of the Ansar Allah movement found in Iranian logistical and ideological support the necessary fuel to militarily challenge the Western allied powers of the Arabian Peninsula. The regional map had been completely transformed without the need for a single Islamic Republic tank to officially cross a border. While the United States bled economically and politically by sustaining eternal occupations in distant deserts, winning tactical battles that did not lead to any real strategic victory, Iran gained real influence in the alleys, in the mosques, in the local parliaments, and in the minds of millions of fighters who were willing to defend their position with rifle in hand. As this second chapter of the historical tragedy closes, the panorama appears completely discouraging for Western diplomacy. That vast regional network is no longer a simple hypothesis or a conjecture by intelligence agency analysts. It is an invisible but extremely lethal fortress that completely surrounds the U.S. military bases distributed throughout the region. When a mortar shell is fired in the desert today, or when a drone silently stalks a North American position, the material origin of the attack is diffuse, hidden behind the changing acronyms of a local militia or an insurgent front, but the political will behind the shot remains exactly the same. Iran managed to build its best geopolitical life insurance, a tragic guarantee that any future attempt to strike directly at the heart of Tehran will never be limited to its territorial borders, but will immediately, absolutely, and mercilessly set fire to the entire soil of the Middle East. How can a territory beset by financial and military isolation directly challenge the most advanced superpower on the planet? The answer is not found in the symmetry of conventional armies, but in a cold, calculated and deeply destructive doctrine, asymmetric technology. Deprived of access to large modern aviation markets and state-of-the-art shipyards, Tehran understood that the only way to balance the scales was to change the rules of physics and military economics. Instead of building a hundreds of million-dollar stealth fighter, they decided to perfect a rustic, massive, and cheap weapon, the Shahid family's 136 kamikaze drone. A noisy device, built with imitation civilian engines and commercial integrated chips purchased over the internet, that flies at low altitude, avoiding traditional radars and defying the concepts of contemporary air defense. The real danger of these flying swarms lies not in their sophistication, but in their devastating economic and numerical logic. A single interceptor projectile from an American Patriot defense system costs nearly $4 million, while the drone it intends to shoot down barely exceeds $20,000. It is a perfect mathematical trap, a war of financial attrition where each tactical victory of the West eats away at its own ammunition stores. Whoever exhausts their high-tech resources first in the middle of the desert loses the game. Added to this arsenal of unmanned ships is the most densified deployment of Fateh and Zulfiqar ballistic missiles in the entire Middle East, capable of hiding in deep underground silos, excavated from the solid rock mountains of the Zagros mountain range, where the surgical bombings of the U.S. aviation lose their protective effectiveness. These underground bases, known as missile cities, operate in literal darkness, ready to overwhelm any enemy shield in a matter of minutes. Iranian generals replaced quality with overwhelming quantity, assuming that no defensive system, no matter how advanced, is capable of stopping hundreds of projectiles approaching simultaneously. The reality of this asymmetric approach is heartbreaking for the Pentagon, which sees its expensive naval deployments and Nimitz-class aircraft carriers become vulnerable to lower-cost technologies mass-produced in the Islamic Republic's sweatshops. However, the true core of this technological resistance, the definitive shield that keeps global security offices in suspense, is the atom. In 2015, international diplomacy seemed to find respite with the signing of the pact known as the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action or JCPOA. That document, signed in a veil of elegance and optimism in the historic halls of Vienna, temporarily froze the Iranian uranium centrifuges in exchange for the lifting of the suffocating financial restrictions that were choking the streets. There was an artificial peace, a tranquility bought with desk pacts that promised to once again integrate the ancient nation into the circuits of world trade. There was talk of a new era of openness in the cafes of Tehran, but in the shadows, distrust remained intact, eating away at the foundations of an agreement that many hardliners considered a covert capitulation. The structure was fragile and rested on the political will of changing administrations that looked at the board with eyes of reproach and suspicion. In 2018, Donald Trump's administration executed the unilateral withdrawal of the United States and pulverized the agreement, returning the stage to the mud of mutual hostility through the strategy of maximum pressure. Economic sanctions returned with devastating force, once again suffocating the daily lives of millions of citizens, devaluing the rial to historic lows and closing the doors that had only just begun to open. But the breakdown of the pact did not return Iran to the negotiating table. On the contrary, it accelerated the engine of its nuclear development at an alarming rate. Today, in the underground complexes of Fordow and Natanz, protected by dozens of meters of reinforced concrete, anti-aircraft defenses, and mountain rock, advanced IR-6 and IR-8 type centrifuges spin day and night without rest, enriching uranium to levels of 60% purity, dangerously close to the 90% required for military-grade atomic device. The landscape of peaceful laboratories has been transformed into a race against time where inspectors from the International Atomic Energy Agency lose track of sensitive material amid empty political speeches, cyber sabotage like the Stuxnet virus, and the targeted assassination of scientists like Mohsen Fakhrizadeh on the roads of Tehran. Tehran's current strategy no longer necessarily seeks the immediate detonation of a bomb that would unleash massive retaliation and destroy the country. Their real goal is to reach the breaking point, the demonstrated technical capacity to build a nuclear weapon in a matter of weeks if the territory is attacked by foreign forces. That scientific and engineering knowledge cannot be covered up, bombarded, or erased by presidential decrees or United Nations resolutions. It is a latent deterrence, a technological life insurance that forces its rivals to weigh each military movement in the region, knowing that on the other side of the rift, the price of a miscalculation would no longer be measured in dollars or controlled material losses, but in a cataphora of absolute scope that would redraw the map of the modern world with ash and fire. As we delve into the implications of this asymmetrical technological parity, the gap between Washington's official military superiority and the reality on the ground becomes a dark chasm. American satellites can monitor every meter of sand, but they cannot stop the proliferation of digital blueprints and local workshops that manufacture resistance. Power is no longer measured only by the size of the fleet or the defense budget, but by the ability to inflict unacceptable punishment on the adversary. Iran has turned its conventional weakness into a hybrid strength, demonstrating that in the 21st century, a determined regional power armed with asymmetric technology can force the greatest superpower in history to pause on the threshold of total war. All the weight of historical memory, the expansion of the shadow militia network and the development of asymmetric technology finally converge on a single critical point on the global map. The Strait of Hormuz, a narrow and strategic maritime channel through which a fifth of the oil transits daily, approximately 21 million barrels of crude oil per day, which moves industries and transportation around the planet. If one observes the geography of this sea crevice, the truth is overwhelming. The deepest shipping routes inevitably pass just a few kilometers from the fortified coasts of the Islamic Republic. We are not facing a simple geographical accident. Hormuz is the true economic lung of the modern world, a vital artery whose collapse would stop international finance in a matter of hours, unleashing a supply crisis that no one knows how to explain but that all markets fear in absolute panic. Tension in these waters is no longer a hypothesis in naval strategy manuals, it is a developing operational reality. The United States Central Command deploys its imposing aircraft carriers, missile cruisers and destroyers in a perimeter containment line, attempting to project an image of absolute control and guaranteed peace. However, that tranquility is a big lie organized in the veil of elegant patrols. Above and hidden in the rocky coves of the Iranian coast, hundreds of fast boats armed with rocket launchers, Savaf series smart sea mines, and Goddard-class pocket submarines designed for naval guerrilla warfare await. American forces operate with bated breath, knowing that their overwhelming technological superiority becomes vulnerable in the narrowness of a channel where the space to react to an ambush is measured in seconds. The current abyss is deepened by the presence of great powers that observe the board from a distance but with very clear interests. For Russia and China, a resilient and heavily armed Iran is not an isolated actor, it is a necessary counterweight, an indispensable strategic pawn to erode the West's global hegemony. The flow of oil to Asian industries through the port of Jask and the military, computer and satellite intelligence cooperation agreements between Tehran and Moscow demonstrate that the decisions made in this strait have a planetary reach. A spark in Hormuz would not cause a localized conflict, it would immediately activate a chain reaction that would force Beijing and Moscow to take open positions, transforming the Persian Gulf into the epicenter of a forced redesign of the global balance of power. Just a few miles from naval routes, the U.S. ground military deployment draws an iron fence around Iran's borders. Dozens of monumental operational bases such as Al Udeid in Qatar, Camp Arifjan in Kuwait and forward bases in Iraq and Syria keep thousands of soldiers on permanent high alert. But this deployment, which apparently demonstrates incontestable power, also represents enormous fragility in the face of the modern war scenario. Tehran's arsenal of precision missiles and saturation drones have each of these garrisons within their reach. The Western headquarters are no longer protected by distance. The ground reality for soldiers in the desert is that they are on the front lines of an electronic, cyber and ballistic combat front where traditional defenses can be overwhelmed by a massive simultaneous offensive. A scenario of open war between these two nations would not follow the patterns of past conflicts. There would be no massive landings or triumphal marches on enemy capitals. It would be a perfect storm of crossed cyber attacks between Washington's Cyber Command and the Electronic Warfare Command of the Revolutionary Guard, aimed at shutting down critical infrastructures, total paralysis of satellite navigation systems and a constant rain of asymmetric projectiles crossing the skies of the Middle East. Energy markets would immediately collapse, sending the price of crude oil to historic levels and plunging industrialized societies into unprecedented economic paralysis. The gap between the triumphalist speeches of political offices and the devastating consequences on the ground would be revealed as a dark abyss that would devour the well-being of millions of people outside the conflict. Recent operations and the unprecedented exchange of direct offensives with intercontinental ballistic missiles and swarms of drones crossing the skies of the region demonstrate that the trigger is ready, forever breaking the old doctrine of war in the shadows. Traditional diplomatic channels, which once operated in secret missions through intermediaries in Oman or Switzerland, are today completely eaten away by decades of broken promises and broken pacts. Neither side seems willing to take a step back for fear of showing weakness to their own public opinion or to their international allies in Beijing, Moscow, or Brussels. Warnings have become ongoing military operations, and the space for negotiation is shrinking at the same rapid pace as underground nuclear centrifuges and naval patrols in the Strait. The abyss is visible to all, majestic in appearance due to the deployment of cutting-edge military technology, but deeply rotten in its diplomatic foundations, sustained only by the wounded pride of two worlds that refuse to understand each other while the second hand of the geopolitical clock moves inexorably towards the point of no return. Wars are not born in the present. Every projectile that crosses the night sky of the Persian Gulf, every economic sanction that freezes assets and stifles daily life in Tehran's commercial avenues, and every threat of total destruction transmitted from official offices in Washington, are not isolated events or sudden decisions by current leaders. They are the direct and tragic continuation of a geopolitical script that began to be written generations ago, an invisible chain of betrayals, revolutions and broken promises that has transformed two former strategic allies of the Cold War into sworn enemies on a worm-eaten board. The majestic deployment of Gerald Ford-class aircraft carriers, the swarms of low-cost drones that saturate radars and the centrifuges spinning in the gloom of underground complexes are just the modern symptoms of a much older disease. A structure sustained only by the wounded pride of two irreconcilable worlds that look at the map with eyes of deep reproach. The gap that separates the White House from the altars of the Islamic Republic is not a simple commercial dispute over the passage of oil or the strategic control of the atom. It is a dark abyss covered in mutual distrust, a moat fed by the blood of thousands of young people buried in the desert and civilian souls lost in the immensity of the sea. Today, as the second hand of the geopolitical clock moves inexorably towards the point of no return in the waters of the Strait of Hormuz, history shows us that military force and the steel of missiles are insufficient to erase the past. Empty speeches of artificial peace can no longer hide the real reality of an exhausted territory on the brink of global energy collapse. And as long as those historical wounds remain wide open, as long as the ghosts of Operation Ajax of 1953, the hostage crisis of 1979, and the commercial Flight 655 tragedy of 1988 continue to rule the minds of the strategists in the barracks, the next military move of this eternal tragedy will continue to be written, inevitably, over the same scars.